Who is piloting the UAPs or UFOs constantly seen in our skies? Where are they from? Why are they here? How long have they been here? What is their mission on planet Earth? Do they come in peace, or do they have more sinister motives? Join Mad Mark as he uncovers the answers to these questions and many more of the mysteries that puzzle us all on Who Are the Aliens? The history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. And now, here's Mad Mark.
Today's episode, my theory on racism, why it exists and who is responsible for it. Could it be the Anunnaki? Brace yourselves. You are not going to want to miss a second of this one. Hello everyone, and welcome to Who Are the Aliens? The history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. I'm Mad Mark, and before I begin, just a reminder to please like, share, and comment. It helps so much. I would also like to mention that I have created a new Facebook page for the show. I have put a link in the show description, so go ahead and follow me over there. I'm hoping that this will become a place where we can all gather to discuss each episode and where you can voice your comments and questions. So please go on over and check that out on Facebook. Now, originally, I had intended to begin this show by continuing our discussion from the last episode about religions, but due to the length of this episode, I have decided to pause that discussion, and we will pick it up again at the beginning of the next show. I want to quickly point out that this episode is quite a bit longer than normal, but there are a lot of aspects to this topic, and I didn't want to interrupt the flow of information by breaking it into two shows. But I seriously doubt that you will even notice this increased length of this program, because this is going to be riveting. Okay, I hope you are ready, because we are about to take a wild ride. Racism has always been something that I have had trouble understanding. I have never had a racist bone in my body, and as a matter of fact, I have had many friends from all races at various times in my life. I've always found it fascinating to learn about other people's cultures and customs, so I decided to take a deep dive into this topic to see what I could find out and learn about it, and then share those findings with all of you. But I was not at all ready for what I eventually uncovered. I have been taken down a rabbit hole that there is no turning back from. The further I dug, the more shocking it became. Some of you may not be ready to hear this. I'm not sure I was. I'm still struggling with everything that I uncovered. In fact, at one point, I doubted if I should even share this with all of you. I am certain that I will, at the very least, be called out for some of what I've learned and for the conclusions that I have arrived at after examining all of this. But I have shown before, time and again on this program, that the Anunnaki changed this planet forever from the moment they arrived here. And that applies to us as well, their creations. Every one of us has been touched by them, whether we want to admit it or not, whether we can handle it or not. And the subject of racism is no exception. Whether intentionally or not, they are responsible for that as well. But I ask you to please listen to this all the way to the end, because there are several different aspects to all of this. And you may hear things as I'm setting up all this evidence that might upset you, or you may think that I'm saying that one race of people is better than another, and I most certainly am not saying that. We are all in this journey called life together. Everybody is important, and no race is any better than the other. I am only interested in discovering the truth, but I assure you that if you listen all the way to the end, I will tie everything together, and it'll all make perfect sense. So, if you're ready, let's do this. Now, when I first started this journey, I found nothing all that earth-shattering. Basically, it was mostly what you would expect to find when researching a subject such as this. The ideology of modern racism originated with European colonialism and the slave trade in the 15th and 16th centuries. But this concept of the white race being in some way superior began emerging as early as the 1300s. Now, it is true that the concept of slavery had existed for thousands of years prior to that, but in the ancient world, it was not based on race. Rather, enslaved people usually came from conquered nations and were often from the same ethnic group as their enslavers. But in the modern era, since the 1300s, the system of racial hierarchy placed white Europeans at the top and others, particularly black people, at the bottom in order to somehow justify their exploitation and lack of freedoms. Racism was the ideological driving force behind the Atlantic slave trade. As the demand for labor increased in the U.S. colonies, European colonizers used the concept of race to justify lifelong inherited slavery, making it quite distinct from other earlier forms of enslavement. In the 17th century, laws were codified in America to solidify this system of hereditary slavery and to ensure that children of enslaved people would also remain enslaved. But although slavery had been abolished by the 19th century in America, racism had matured as a formal ideology and spread globally, becoming a major force behind colonial projects and segregationist systems such as apartheid in South Africa and Jim Crow here in the U.S. So, while racism and slavery often go hand in hand, they are also two completely separate entities, with slavery having existed for thousands of years before racism ever reared its ugly head. Well, that's all very interesting, and I must say that it is pretty much exactly what I expected to find. There's nothing really new or earth-shattering in that information, but there's more to this story, much more. Okay, so the first question that popped into my head was, why did certain white Europeans beginning in the 1300s suddenly believe that they were somehow better than other races? One of the things that I stumbled on was the fact that during slavery in America, many of the white slave owners looked upon their slaves as not much more than glorified pets. And then it hit me. That was the statement that sent me down the rabbit hole. Because upon reading that, my mind immediately flashed back to what I read years earlier about the Anunnaki's disdain for humans, how they looked at us as a labor force and as little more than glorified pets. And that got me to thinking. Remember way back on an earlier episode, I talked about how shortly after creating the first humans, each Anunnaki wanted their humans branded so that their humans would look different than the humans owned by other gods? And that fact accounts for why we all look different depending on what region of Earth we are from. It has nothing to do with the weather or the sun or anything else that we have been led to believe. It was all branding. Race was never actually determined by a particular people's proximity to the sun. In other words, people with darker skin originated in Africa because they got more sun there, and white people originated in Europe because they got less sun. These are all lies. It's what they want you to believe. But it is not true, and I can prove it. Let's look at some facts. Here we see a photo of some modern-day white Australians. Now, Australia is one of the top 5 regions of the Earth with the most annual sunlight. Australia was first colonized by the British in 1788. That's 237 years, 7 generations of white people living in one of the warmest and sunniest areas on the planet. And, as far as I can tell, they are not turning black. And you want to talk about Africa? Okay, Let's talk about Africa, South Africa to be specific. The White Dutch first colonized South Africa in the year 1652. That's 373 years ago, or 9 generations. And from this photo taken just a couple months ago of South African refugees coming to America, we can see that they too are not turning black. Now, let's examine the Inuit people, who live in some of the coldest areas on planet Earth, the Arctic regions of Greenland, Canada, Alaska, and Russia. They are obviously not black-skinned, but they are most definitely darker than Caucasians, and they live in the coldest regions on the planet. And the same thing applies to the many dark-skinned people currently residing in colder countries such as Norway, Sweden, Greenland, and Canada. They are not turning white. According to the ancient Sumerian texts, humans were created roughly 300,000 years ago. But in all of the ancient sources of information, there is never any mention of white humans. I had just assumed that white skin was simply another variant created by the Anunnaki, but I was wrong. Did you know that white people, or Caucasians, did not appear on planet Earth until somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago? And from where did they originate? In an area of Eastern Europe and Western Asia known as the Caucasus Mountains, which is where the term Caucasian comes from. And where exactly are these mountains? Only about 1,000 miles from the Anunnaki base of operations in Sumeria. Now, I've already proven on past episodes that the Anunnaki were global. They could travel anywhere on the planet that they chose to, and they did. But I find it ironic that white people on planet Earth originated roughly 1,000 miles to the north of the Anunnaki home base, about as far as Israel is to the east of Sumeria. Very interesting. So, if the Caucasian race is basically the new kids on the block as far as races are concerned, meaning that they are the youngest race of humans on Earth, where did some of them ever get the idea that they were somehow superior to the other races on the planet? After all, at one point, Europe had been inhabited by only dark-skinned people, and that was the place where racism first began in the 1300s. I'm not trying to say that skin color has nothing to do with where a species lives, but an entire species on any given planet would all have basically the same color skin, and that would be determined by the conditions on said planet at the time that species was in development. I guess basically what I'm trying to say here is that white-skinned people like myself should not exist on this planet. There, I said it. It's all out in the open now. And if you are a white person watching this, you're undoubtedly a little ticked off right now, and I don't blame you. I was when I first stumbled on this information. But please hang around and allow me to explain and present my evidence on how I reached this conclusion. The first thing I did was to present a hypothetical question to AI, and that question was, if there were human beings on every planet in our solar system, what would the skin color of each planet's inhabitants be? And the answer given was that the inhabitants of the first 3 planets closest to the sun would be dark-skinned. In case you didn't know, Earth is the 3rd planet from the sun. It then went on to say that the further out you go from there, the lighter the skin color would be. And the planets that are furthest from the sun, beginning with Saturn, would be predominantly white-skinned. And by the time you reached Pluto, the skin of these beings would be so light that they would almost seem to be opaque. So here on Earth, the people should be predominantly black or various shades of brown skin. And that makes perfect sense, because if you look at Homo erectus, the beings that were on Earth at the time the Anunnaki first arrived here, the species that were used to create us, they were a dark-skinned global species. They existed basically everywhere on the planet, and they were all dark-skinned. There were no white-skinned Homo erectus, even in the coldest regions of Earth at that time. So white skin is not native to our planet. More proof of this can be found by examining skin cancer rates among the various races on our planet. The main cause of skin cancer, or melanoma to use the medical terminology, is direct exposure to ultraviolet radiation from the sun. And cases of skin cancer are predominantly higher in white-skinned individuals. Why? Because they don't have the required amount of melanin to properly protect them from the sun's radiation. It seems odd to me that this would be the case if white people were native to this planet. Now, let's look at something as simple as sunburn. Once again, the research indicates that the rate of sunburn in white-skinned individuals is far greater than it is for dark-skinned people. How would a race of people have ever developed naturally on a planet where their own skin can't protect them properly from their own sun's radiation? So how do we account for the fact that white-skinned people are here on a planet where they should not exist? And once again, it all leads us back to the Anunnaki. Now, I have seen a few videos on TikTok where the Anunnaki are portrayed as being black or dark-skinned. Now, personally, I wouldn't care. As I've said before, I try to love everybody. Skin color is unimportant to me, and I certainly hope that I do not offend any of my black brothers and sisters out there, but the fact of the matter is the Anunnaki are white. In fact, they are very white, and I have some facts to back up this statement. I'll begin with the lesser facts and then move on up to the biggest ones. First of all, we have this. Here I have some artwork I found online depicting the various Anunnaki gods. As you can see, they are portrayed here as being white. Now, as I said, this is weak evidence. I'm not even sure who drew this, but I suggest that they were even whiter than shown here. I believe that they were very white. Then we have this photo. This one shows an ancient carving of one of the Anunnaki. Since it is in stone, it's hard to say for sure what color his skin was, but he sure looks white to me. And on the right side, we see an artist's rendering of Gilgamesh. He was, of course, the result of coitus between an Anunnaki and a human, which would explain his dark beard, but again, he is depicted as white-skinned. And now, on to some stronger evidence. How about Montezuma, the Aztec king who in 1519 mistook Hernan Cortez as his returning god Quetzalcoatl, who was, of course, the Anunnaki known as Thoth. This tragic mistake was made because Cortez had lighter skin and, according to the ancient texts of his people, Quetzalcoatl was a light-skinned, bearded deity. Then there's this. Remember back on episode 5 or 6 when I was talking about when the Anunnaki created humans as their labor force, and they had a nickname for this new creation. Do you remember that? They not only called the first humans the dark-headed ones, but they continued to refer to them as that for many years to come. Now, logically speaking, if the Anunnaki were black and they created a race of black slaves, do you really think that they would refer to them as the dark-headed ones? That seems a bit ridiculous, don't you think? And the final bit of evidence I wish to present goes all the way back to what I said earlier in the show about the hypothetical question that I asked AI. If there were humans on every planet in our solar system, what color would each planet's humans be? Remember that? And it's said that the outer planets, like Pluto and Uranus, the ones furthest from the sun, would have such light skin that it would appear to be almost opaque. Now imagine this scenario. You have beings on a planet, let's call it Nibiru, that takes 3,600 years to make one orbit of our sun. And only 1 year of that time does it come into the heart of our solar system and spend any time at all anywhere near the sun. That's 3,599 years at a time, with very little sunlight at all, if any. If beings on Uranus and Pluto would have opaque skin from lack of sunlight, what color do you imagine that these beings would be? There, you see? You've just answered the question for yourself. The Anunnaki are extremely white, and I'll tell you something else. I hear researchers all the time talking about those little handbags or purses that the Anunnaki always seem to be carrying with them in most of their depictions. Until the past few months of gathering information for this episode, I always concluded that those bags carried the Mies, or the ancient wisdom, and those may be part of the contents of the purses. But remember, these Anunnaki were definitely not used to the daily radiation, brightness, and heat of being on a planet this close to the sun, especially when they were outside. And also, considering the areas of Earth that they frequented the most often, Mesopotamia, Africa, South America, these purses would have almost assuredly contained the many ointments and oils that they would have had to constantly apply to their skin to prevent them from being burnt to a crisp. And there's one more thing that I would like to mention. On the topic of alien interaction, we have all heard the stories of people claiming to have been abducted by Nordic-looking aliens. Alleged abductees describe these Nordic aliens as being somewhat taller than the average human, standing roughly 6 to 7 feet tall, and showing stereotypically European or white features such as long straight blonde hair, blue eyes, and very fair skin. If you've ever been abducted by one of these beings, congratulations, you've had direct contact with the Anunnaki. And, oddly enough, this brings us to World War II, the Nazis, and Adolf Hitler. If you remember your history lessons at all, you will remember that Hitler was obsessed with researching the Aryan race. At a time when he probably should have been giving 100% of his attention to the war effort, he was constantly distracted by his beliefs that the Aryan race was superior. And this is where it gets really interesting. Hitler sent people all over the Middle East in his efforts to prove that not only was the Aryan race somehow superior, but that they had originated in either ancient Sumeria, Egypt, or both. While it's true that Hitler's goal was to use whatever his people uncovered for his own political gain, this man, who had brown hair and brown eyes, believed passionately that there was something special about these Aryans, these people with blonde hair and blue eyes. What he didn't realize was that what he was seeking was, in fact, the Anunnaki. Heinrich Himmler, the Reich leader of the dreaded SS of the Nazi Party and Hitler's right-hand man, believed that a hidden, superior Aryan civilization was responsible for all great human achievements. Again, what we're talking about here is the Anunnaki, and he sought out archaeological evidence throughout the world to prove his theory. One of those places he searched was Iraq, home of ancient Sumer. His driving belief was that the Sumerians and the Babylonians were descendants of a lost Atlantean and/or Nordic race that had eventually declined due to race mixing. This is fascinating because the lost civilization of Atlantis was just another name for the Anunnaki civilization that existed here on Earth before the Great Flood. They obviously did not realize that. Thoth, the son of Enki, often refers to himself in his emerald tablets as Thoth the Atlantean. But this is where these Nazi researchers went wrong. Instead of attempting to prove this Aryan superiority for their own political gain, they should have been attempting to trace the origins of the Aryan race back to its roots, back to the Anunnaki. And this information was available during the time frame of the Nazi rise to power in the 1930s and 40s. Henry Rawlinson had successfully deciphered the ancient Sumerian texts 100 years earlier in the mid-1850s, and they must have been at least familiar with this information because they were right there. They knew that there was a connection between the white race and ancient Sumeria. Perhaps they were so blinded by their need to prove that this Aryan race was somehow superior that they completely missed the connection to its true origins. Or perhaps they actually read about the Anunnaki but didn't believe that it was the truth. They knew that they were onto something, but they didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle. No matter how they tried, they weren't quite able to connect all the dots and tie it all together. But today, thanks to the internet, we can. We have information at our fingertips. Today we can figure this out. If you watch this show, you can figure this out. But what does this term Aryan actually mean? The word originated as a self-designation used by the Proto-Indo-Iranians. So it came from the region originally known as Sumer, and in the ancient Iranian Sanskrit language, it means noble, respectable, and honorable. In fact, the name of the country of Iran means land of the Aryans. The Nazis couldn't see the forest for the trees. They were so focused on trying to prove that these Aryans were somehow superior that they didn't think to answer the question of why. What started it? They got as far as third base, but they couldn't bring it home to the Anunnaki. If they had actually dug just a little bit deeper and read about the things that we have been discussing on this program, they could have easily made the connection, because they would have realized that what the author of the book that they based their entire theory on was voicing the exact same concerns as Enlil had thousands of years earlier. Arthur de Gobineau was a French writer, and his book, An Essay on the Inequality of the Human Races, published in 1853, was one of the foundational texts of the Nazi racism theory. In his book, he stated that civilization was the product of the white race, or, as we now know, the Anunnaki, and that racial decline was caused by intermarriage with supposedly inferior races. Boy, that sure sounds like the words of Enlil to me. Remember back to when we were discussing the events that led up to the Great Flood? Why did Enlil want all of the humans to perish? Because the Anunnaki males were having so much sex with human females that he was afraid of what? That it would dilute the Anunnaki gene pool. But this did not solve the problem, because once the humans repopulated the planet, what happened? The Anunnaki started having sex with humans again. Enki, Marduk, and others that we don't even know the names of. And this time, it wasn't just the male Anunnaki getting in on the act. Oh no. Inanna Ishtar was well known for having sex with every human king that she put into power under her. Hell, they were probably under her, over her, and everywhere in between. Nope, these white Anunnaki simply could not resist the sexuality of these dark-skinned humans. And Enlil's greatest fears came true. But it not only diluted the Anunnaki gene pool with human DNA, oh no, the human gene pool was diluted with Anunnaki DNA as well. Now, as I stated on an earlier episode, we all have Anunnaki DNA inside us. That's how we were created. By mixing Homo erectus DNA with their own, just enough of it to give these new beings the brain power to do the tasks that the Anunnaki needed done. But when the white Anunnaki gene began manifesting in humans, well, I guess those folks got just a little something extra, didn't they? Of course, this is all pretty irrelevant these days. It's been several thousand years since then, and the gene pool has become pretty diluted. I myself am white, but I have, or at least had, brown hair and brown eyes. Not that there aren't still white people with blonde hair and blue eyes, but does that make them something special? Does that mean that they are somehow better than the rest of us? After all this time, probably not. But what if it did? Could blonde-haired, blue-eyed white people be in some way closer to the gods than the rest of us? Let's play a little game and imagine for a moment that that were true. What do we know about the Anunnaki that would make them better than us humans? Well, we know that they have better tech than we do. I mean, they used it to create us, right? But we have to remember that they had a 45 million year head start on us. Remember that from episode 4? Hell, we could now create a new species too if there weren't laws to prevent it. So we can scrap that one. There's really no advantage there. The only bodily advantage that they have over us is, of course, their longevity. As I covered on an earlier episode, they live for thousands of years due to the massive length of time that it takes their planet to make one revolution around the sun. But as far as I can tell, that trait has not been passed on to any humans. Most people don't make it to 90 years old. So I don't think the Aryans inherited the longevity gene either. So what about their behaviors, their principles? Are they morally better than we are? What instrument can we use to determine that? We can't use the 10 Commandments because those were written by Marduk, and he obviously subscribed to the school of do as I say, not as I do, because he's damn near broken all of them. So the only other unit of measurement that I can think of to compare the morality of humans versus Anunnaki are the 7 deadly sins. Let's examine that method for comparison, shall we? Now, according to the Roman Catholic Church, these are the 7 vices that give rise to other sins and further immoral behavior. We've all fallen victim to one or more of these in our lives. I myself can recall times where I suffered from 3 of them. But if, as I have proven today, white people, and particularly the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan race, are indeed direct descendants of the Anunnaki, does that mean that they are somehow superior to the rest of humanity? Are the Anunnaki morally superior to humans? Are these beings who came to Earth, created us, and then posed as gods really all that holy? Because one would certainly assume that any being posing as a god would show some signs of lofty behavior, correct? Okay, the number 1 deadly sin is pride. Did the Anunnaki ever display signs of pridefulness? I have one word for you, Marduk. If any being on this planet ever showed signs of pridefulness, it was him, the deity that all of the Abrahamic faiths are based on. In fact, I think that if you look up the word pride in the dictionary, you'll find a photo of Marduk. Okay, deadly sin number 2 is greed. Have the Anunnaki ever shown signs of that? Again, Marduk comes to mind. His unending quest to be the one true god of planet Earth was actually quite greedy. But he wasn't the only Anunnaki that was guilty of this. Enki, Enlil, and just about every member of the Pantheon of 12 who ever started one of the ancient wars on this planet did so because they coveted something that another member of the group either owned or controlled. So yes, the majority of them were guilty of greed. Number 3 is lust. Oh boy, do the Anunnaki ever have a problem with that one? Many of them could not resist having sex with humans, many times with multiple partners. Even the female Inanna Ishtar was guilty of this one. Yes, I think it is safe to say that the Anunnaki are lustful beings. Wow, they're not faring very well in our little test here so far, are they? Okay, sin number 4, envy. Well, that's pretty much the same as greed, wanting something that somebody else possesses. Yes, many of the Anunnaki are guilty of envy. At position number 5 in our countdown is wrath. Did any of these gods ever suffer from this deadly sin? Why, yes, indeed they did. Marduk again comes to mind. In his quest for world domination, he pretty much cut down anybody who stood in his way like dogs in the street. But I think the Anunnaki who holds this title would have to be Enlil. Just look at all the original Anunnaki stories from the early days, before Marduk's rise to power. Enlil was constantly wrathful with Enki every time his brother attempted to help the humans. Enlil was wrathful when he allowed the humans to be wiped out in the Great Flood. Enlil was again wrathful when he confused our languages after the Tower of Babel incident. Yes, if any Anunnaki is guilty of wrathful behavior, it would have to be Enlil. Now, these last two are a little bit tougher. We have gluttony and sloth. The ancient texts really don't mention much about the Anunnaki's eating habits, but every carving or statue of them always depicts them as being healthy and muscular, so I'm going to give them a pass on that one, because we have no proof of any of them suffering from gluttony. Now, that doesn't mean that none of them did it. It just means that we have no proof of it, so let's be fair here. And sloth, was there ever a time when the Anunnaki appeared to be lazy? I mean, one could argue that when the Igigi revolted in the gold mines after several thousand years of hard labor, and the Pantheon of Twelve's response was to create their own workforce, humans, instead of pitching in and actually doing the work themselves, could be taken as lazy. But most of them were Nibirian royalty, so I'm going to go ahead and make the call in their favor on that one as well. Overall, I would have to say that the Anunnaki did not really show any signs of sloth. But even giving them the benefit of the doubt on those last two sins, that is still a score of 5 deadly sins out of 7. Any educator would back me when I say that I would have to fail the Anunnaki at this point. Don't you agree? One point that I would like to make here, before I pass sentence, is that there was one Anunnaki whom I don't believe ever showed any signs of these sins, that being Thoth. In fact, if I had to hold up any of these Anunnaki ancient astronauts as actually behaving in a godly fashion day in and day out, it would be him. As far as I can tell, he always tried to do the right thing and always displayed love and compassion. So he gets a hard pass here. Yes, I am also a fan of Enki and Inanna Ishtar, but unfortunately, they both showed signs of suffering from one or more of these sins at various points in time, so they will have to face sentence along with all the rest. So the findings of this court are as follows. While the Anunnaki do possess far greater technology than we humans may ever hope to have, and while they certainly do live much longer lifespans than we do, I see absolutely zero evidence that they as a species possess any greater honesty, integrity, compassion, empathy, or morality than we humans do. And as such, I find them guilty of fraud in posing as gods on this planet. They may have created us, and as I've shown today, they may even be the true origin of white-skinned humans on our planet. But as living, breathing beings, they are no better than we are, certainly not superior. And who knows, if life here on Earth had been given the 45 million year head start that Nibiru received, perhaps we would have done a better job of things. This court stands adjourned. So what does all of this have to do with racism? Just in case you haven't figured it out yet, please allow me to tie it all together for you. It involves a little thing called behavioral genetics. We've all either had this happen to us or we know someone who has. You're at a large family gathering. It could be Christmas, Thanksgiving, a family reunion, any situation where a huge group of family members consisting of many generations is present. One of the younger people will absent-mindedly do something out of habit without even thinking about it. Any little thing that people do. It could be picking your fingers or biting your nails or even tugging on your earlobe, and suddenly one of the older people will excitedly point at you and exclaim, "Look what so and so, whatever your name is doing. Uncle Bill or Aunt Betsy, whoever, used to do that exact same thing." Now, you might never have even known this aunt or uncle. They may have died before you were even born. But here you are, all these years later, displaying the same behavioral trait as this deceased relative that you never even knew. That is what is known as behavioral genetics. In my case, it was slopping my slippers. My grandfather, who I loved very much, used to have this habit of slopping his slippers. He liked to wear slippers that were open-heeled, and when he walked, he sort of shuffled his feet, and the heels of his slippers would make a sort of slop-pop sound. It used to drive my grandmother crazy. In fact, on her deathbed, she even commented to my mother that, well, at least I won't have to hear Grandpa's slopping slippers anymore. Years later, when I was in my 40s, without even thinking about it, I began absent-mindedly squishing down the backs of my slippers with my heels, which effectively turned them into heelless slippers, and I would shuffle and slop around the house just like my grandfather had done so long ago. I didn't even realize I was doing it, and this went on for years, until one day, as I was slopping down the hallway, I must have been thinking about Grandpa, because that's when it hit me. I'm walking exactly how Grandpa used to. I quickly corrected the situation, and I've never done it since. But that is a perfect example of behavioral genetics. Performing some action, the exact same action as someone you are distantly related to did years before, absent-mindedly, without even thinking about it. It just happens. And the same thing can apply to our thoughts. Science tells us that genes can influence a person's predisposition toward certain traits and behaviors that may make them more or less likely to adopt particular beliefs. Genes can influence personality traits, temperament, intelligence, and mental health, all of which form a framework for how individuals might respond in any given situation. So, while racism can and has been influenced by environment, in other words, if a person is raised by racist parents, they have a much greater chance of becoming a racist themselves, it can also be caused by behavioral genetics. And I believe that that is the reason racism first began showing up way back in the 1300s. So let's recap everything that we've learned today and bring this all together. So, 450,000 years ago, the white-skinned, blue-eyed, and blonde-haired Anunnaki arrived on planet Earth to mine gold to save their planet's atmosphere. But after thousands of years in the mines, the working class revolted, leaving the Council of 12 little choice but to create their own slave labor force. They did so by combining their DNA with the Homo erectus, which was the dark-skinned hominid on Earth at that time. If you're interested in the deeper details of any of this, please check out my earlier episodes. But to make a long story short, over time, the Anunnaki began having sexual relations with the slaves that they had created. Even the Great Flood could not prevent this from happening, because as soon as civilization was restored afterwards, the sexual relations between masters and slaves began yet again. Eventually, this led to the Anunnaki features of white skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes being incorporated into human DNA. And after thousands of years of humanity's skin color being various shades of brown, white-skinned humans began to emerge from the Caucasus mountain region, roughly 1,000 miles north of Sumer, which had been the Anunnaki's principal base of operations since they first arrived on planet Earth. As the centuries passed, these Caucasians migrated further and further to the north and west, eventually becoming the predominant race on the European continent. And at some point in the 1300s, racism began to emerge. Suddenly, random members of this white-skinned race, the newest race on Earth after thousands of years of dark-skinned humans, began to believe that they were somehow superior to the others. Why? Because, as we've discovered on this episode, something called behavioral genetics. Some small part of them was remembering a time when the white-skinned Anunnaki created the dark-skinned humans and looked upon them as slaves or little more than glorified pets. I'm sure they had no idea where these thoughts and feelings were even coming from. By this time, the Anunnaki gods had retreated into the shadows, forgotten by most, and categorized as myths and legends by the rest. But even though the gods were gone, this suppressed concept of white superiority still remained, and racism was born from it. So where does this leave us in these modern times? As I've said many times on this program, we have to learn from the past if we are to change our future. The Anunnaki may have indirectly created this mess, but it's up to us to fix it. We are all in this together. Much of what happened in the past was out of our control. We can't change that. But the future lies ahead, and it's up to all of us to make it better. We are humanity, all of us together. What was it that Enlil said at the Tower of Babel? Now nothing that they plan to do will be impossible for them. I say we live up to those words, because we have to live up to them. Because divided, we are weak. But if we stand together, we are strong. Everyone and everything was created for a purpose. Do you dare to question the judgment of the universe? It is the creator of all, and it needs all of its components in order to realize its purpose. We are all a part of the universal plan. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. We are all a part of the all that is, and we are all necessary. We are each a part of the universal consciousness. And as such, we all have universal power. What is important is not what's on the outside of us here. What is truly important is what is on the inside of us in here. Always walk in love towards everyone and everything, because it is all a part of you, and you are a part of it. When you do harm to another, you are harming the universe and therefore harming yourself. And that is where I leave you for this episode. You have quite a lot to digest there, and we have so much more to cover and learn. I'm Mad Mark, and I sincerely hope that you've enjoyed this episode. Please like, share, and comment. It helps so much. And please tell your friends and help spread the word about this show. If you have any questions regarding the content discussed on this program, just message me through madmarktv.com or on any of my social media platforms. Who are the aliens? The history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth is written and produced by me, Mad Mark. Today we've taken another step in our ongoing journey to discover the truth. I promise you that things will get more and more interesting the further we delve into this topic of who are the aliens, the history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. Bye for now.
You've been listening to Who Are the Aliens? The History of the Anunnaki on Planet Earth with your host, Mad Mark. Join us again on our next program when Mad Mark will once again uncover the answers to the mysteries that puzzle mankind.